So I teach history of religions, I teach philosophy and modern art. Literature, just a little bit. Yeah, kind of literature. So my talk is about crucifixion in 20th century painting. And here is basically what I'm going to do. I will briefly give you some historical background. And then I move on to the 20th century, and in the 20th century I will follow the succession of modern art movements. I will give you examples of crucifixions that come from 20th century expressionism, cubism, surrealism, abstraction, and postmodernism. And then I will conclude with my own thesis, so to say. But as for the thesis, my thesis is actually as follows. In the history of Christian art, there were three types of crucifixions. The first one may be called a Byzantine crucifixion. The second one, the Catholic crucifixion. They correspond basically to the progress of Christianity or to the development of Christianity throughout the ages. The third one was related to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance crucifixion. And then my thesis is that in the 19th and the 20th century, we witness the invention of the fourth type of crucifixion, what I would call modern existential or modern existentialist, not to be confused with existentialism as a philosophical movement. And by giving examples of Cubist, Expressionist, Surrealist, Abstract, and Postmodern crucifixions, I will try to show you what kind of crucifixion we are dealing with. So let me begin with some historical background. As you know, crucifixion is the central event in Christianity. What distinguishes Christianity from other religions is the uniqueness of Jesus' mediation. Jesus as the unique mediator between the divine and the human realm. So Christianity, unlike some other religions, for example, Judaism and Islam, Christianity is not only about the teaching of Jesus, but it is also about his life, his death and resurrection. So usually when I discuss with my students this topic, I ask them, what if you change something in Judaism and Islam? What if it is not Moses, but someone else who delivers the law? Would this change Judaism? And the answer is no. Because to be a Jew, to be a good Jew means to follow the law. The same in Islam. To be a good Muslim means to believe that Muhammad is God's prophet and to follow the law. Christianity is different. It's not only about what you believe, but it's about this unique mediation that was delivered by Jesus. It's not only about what he taught, but how he lived. So, but the thing is that in the Roman Empire, crucifixion was the capital punishment that was reserved for the worst criminals. And therefore, Christians found themselves in a rather ambiguous situation when they followed the person who was believed to be criminal. So therefore, they did not emphasize in their art crucifixion. So this is the earliest crucifixion that we know of that dates back to the 5th century. So they may have been earlier crucifixions, maybe. But still, this is the first one we know of, and it's interesting that it comes from the 5th century, the 5th century being a decisive century for Christianity. Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire by the end of the 4th century. So Christianity was legalized. It was okay to produce that kind of art. So that's one thing. And the second thing to notice, if you look at Jesus here, he is very different from how he would be portrayed later on. He is muscular, he is young, his eyes are wide open, so there is no sense of humiliation, defeat, suffering, death, those kind of things that would later appear in crucifixions. So that's how it all started. Bless you. Now, to the Byzantine crucifixion. This is my example of a Byzantine crucifixion, a mosaic in the monastery church in Daphne in Greece, 11th century. So as I said, there are three types of crucifixion that arise in the history of the Christian church. This is the first one. It is Byzantine because it was developed mainly in the Byzantine Empire that survived after the western part of the empire fell to the barbarians in the 5th century. And it gives us a sense of the combination of classical art and Christian supernaturalism that would be characteristic of the Byzantine art. And plus, in Byzantium, this kind of art still retains the characteristics of a devotional object. You know, the difference between Christian art in the East and Christian art in the West is that in the East, it is still an object of devotion. And today in Orthodox churches, they use icons as devotional objects, as the mirror to heaven. In the West, Christian art was developed basically for the purposes of education. People could not read, and therefore they had to be educated in their own religion. So when you enter the church, you see all those artistic depictions, and you basically learn from them. But it was, again, more educational, less devotional. This is my example of the second type of crucifixion, which is the Catholic crucifixion. Now, relatively infrequent in the first 10 Christian centuries, in the second millennium, crucifixion becomes the central episode of the Passion cycle and the principal theme of Christian art. So this is medieval or Catholic crucifixion, which is very different from the early crucifixions and from the Byzantine crucifixions. Again, if you compare here, if you look at the figure of Jesus, although his face is full of sorrow, but his eyes are still open. And the overall figure looks like it is airy and kind of floating in the air. So there is less emphasis on suffering and death, but more emphasis on resurrection and glory. And if you compare this with the medieval or Catholic crucifixion, if you look at the face, you see that Jesus' face is full of suffering and pain. And that's what medieval crucifixions would emphasize. Pain, suffering, agony. And the reason why they would do this is because Catholic theology would concentrate on the redemptive power of Jesus' death. So redemption comes through suffering and agony, hence the change in crucifixions. Now, the third type of crucifixion paintings that arise in the history of the Christian church and art would be the Renaissance crucifixions. As you probably know, the Renaissance discovered the perspective, the way to paint in such a way as to see the painting as the mirror to the external world. So three-dimensional perspective, the vanishing point, that is one characteristic feature of the Renaissance art. The second one is a newfound interest in history and historical reality of the events. Hence, the two major features of the Renaissance crucifixions. First, more emphasis on history, on how it really happened, rather than the symbolism of it. And second, the three-dimensional perspective, the way the painting is constructed. For example, the vanishing point here is somewhere here, so we see it Jesus who is above us, and we see it the grave who is below us. This is just another example of a Renaissance crucifixion by Raphael. And here I wanted to point out the fact that even in the Renaissance, even in the West, when crucifixion, where Christian art was used for educational purposes, not for devotional purposes, even here we still have traditional Christian symbolism in the painting. For example, the sun and the moon are the symbols of Christ's sovereignty. What else? Angels. These are the witnesses to crucifixion: John the Apostle and Mary, the mother of Jesus. In some paintings, there will be centurions here, the Roman soldiers, and the Pharisees. So we still have the symbolism according to which, if you see the lion would be the symbol of Jesus' resurrection and ascension, the lion and the eagle, resurrection and ascension. If you see the serpent, that would be the symbol of the Satan and the sin. So sun and the moon, the symbols of Christ's sovereignty. The tree of life is the symbol of salvation, etc. Now, before we move on to the 20th century, just a couple of examples of pre-20th century crucifixions that are very important for 20th century artists, that exerted major influence on 20th century artists. This is one of them. Crucifixion by Grunewald, very famous for the hands. That would be used in German Expressionism as well as in some other paintings. This is El Greco, Christ on the cross, which is in Louvre. And let me tell you, I've been in Louvre, and I looked at this painting, and it's not gray, it's dark blue. So let me point out, it's actually dark blue, and that makes a difference. And Paul Gauguin, another influence on 20th century artists, especially on postmodernists. Postmodernists would, be interested in the issues of identity and would conflate Christ with primitive culture. So this is one of the prototypes of those kind of crucifixions. So now we move on to the 20th century. And as I told you, my thesis is that the 19th and the 20th century, and especially the 20th century, in the 20th century, we see the rise of a new type of crucifixion. It's neither Byzantine, nor Catholic, nor Renaissance. It can be called modern. It can be called modern existential. Again, not to confuse with existentialism as a philosophical movement. And the main features of this type of crucifixion is that it becomes disassociated with Christian theology and Christian ideology, and sometimes even with Christian religion. And crucifixion becomes the symbol of righteous suffering, through which a 20th century artist would look at the events of contemporary time. And therefore, modern crucifixion was used for religious as well as for non-religious purposes, not anti-religious, but non-religious, definitely, because some of the painters that would make crucifixions in the 20th century would be Christian, but some would not be Christian, some would be secular, and some would even be atheists, like, for example, Pablo Picasso. So really, it's not about religion in the 20th century. It becomes more universal, and it becomes more about, again, righteous suffering, which, of course, speaks to the 20th century people. So we start with Expressionism. Expressionism was the first 20th century movement. Started in the beginning of the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And Expressionism was of two kinds, French and German Expressionism. Now, if you are familiar with the history of 20th century painting, you may remember now Henri Matisse and his famous Joie de vivre, Joy of Life. This is French Expressionism, and we will not need that because it's full of color, joy of life, and things like that. This is not suitable for crucifixions, obviously, because crucifixions are about different kinds of emotions. So for crucifixions, German Expressionism was an ideal vehicle. Because German Expressionism was about negative feelings and emotions, the feelings of sadness and sorrow and anxiety and depression and all those kind of things that were the best fit for the crucifixion paintings. Now, this is just one example of German Expressionist crucifixion by Emil Nolde, made in 1912. It's a very famous painting. It was very controversial back in 1912. German Expressionism was developed in Germany, but it had two schools, the so-called Blue Rider and the Dresden group, the Bridge. So Blue Rider was more of an abstract kind of expressionism, and it was led by Kandinsky, the founder of abstraction. And the Dresden group was more of an expressionist kind. And Emil Nolde was a member of the Bridge in Dresden for less than a year. But still he is considered to be a part of that group, and he is probably the most famous painter of that group. He was a very religious person himself, but his religiosity was not dogmatic. He was familiar with the Bible. He read the Bible from his childhood, but he was less familiar with Christian theology, and he thought that this helped him create religious paintings that transcend the boundaries of certain denominations or certain Christian groups. Paintings that express religious feelings rather than a specific theology. And in this way, Emil Nolde basically created this new type of crucifixion, a crucifixion that is not about specific theology, but it's about religious feelings, emotions, and even more so, it's about, again, the idea of righteous suffering that can be applied both to religious and secular world. So this painting was very controversial because of the way he portrayed Jesus. Completely non-canonical. The faces of those people are full of anger and sadness and sorrow, etc., but not in the way Christ and those who were witnesses to the crucifixion were portrayed before. So he was criticized for this painting, but this painting stands as the prime example of what will become the typical 20th century crucifixion. So here is another example of an expressionist crucifixion by Georges Rouault. A French painter, a religious person whose style is characterized by a mixture of expressionism and primitivism. Rouault's crucifixions are calmer, less violent than Nolde's crucifixions, because Nolde's style was often characterized as hysterical mysticism. And I think that is a good way to characterize it. Hysterical mysticism. Of course, this crucifixion is very different. There is a sense of serenity here. And an interesting feature is that the hands of Christ are never ending, which is symbolic of the belief that Christ saves everybody, and everybody is invited. Now to the second movement, Cubism. Have you seen this painting before by Picasso? Yeah, when we read about Picasso, we rarely see this painting. We all know that Picasso was an atheist. He was the member of the Communist Party. He made Guernica and his earlier Cubist pieces, but we rarely see this piece. And this is his crucifixion made in 1930. And this is just a couple of years before he painted Guernica. And there is a deep connection between Guernica and this crucifixion. Just let me tell you a couple of words about Cubism and Picasso. Cubism was the second major innovation in Western painting in the 20th century. Cubism was started by Picasso and Braque in Paris. And the main purpose of Cubism was to see to see the way the painter does his painting in a different way, not visually but conceptually. So this dissection of the object into various pieces can be seen as a conceptual view of the world. It was also described as a simultaneous perspective, as if we look at the object from all possible sides. Now, when you read about Cubism in art history books, you often read about Cubism being a different style of painting, a stylistic phenomenon. And Picasso himself, when asked about his painting, he would usually reply that there is no connection between his personal ideology, his personal worldview, and his painting. He would say, yes, I'm a member of the Communist Party, but this has nothing to do with the way I paint. The shoemakers make shoes. I'm a painter. I make paintings, and that's the way it is. So he was always avoiding the issue of the spiritual dimension of Cubism, in other words. And again, when I teach Cubism to my students, when I talk to art history teachers, they usually talk about the stylistic phenomena, but nothing about the spiritual dimension behind Cubism. In my tradition, the most famous 20th century Russian philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev had a totally different view of Cubism. When he went to see the exhibition of Cubist paintings in 1917, he was horrified by this deconstruction, dematerialization, dissection of the material world. And he wrote an article about that in which he said that Picasso basically is a symptom of a deep crisis of culture. It's a decay of culture, it's a decay of spirituality, and Picasso is the great painter because he unmasks this crisis. So I would subscribe to this understanding of Cubism because often when you look at Picasso's portraits, they look like corpses, frankly. Now, why would he paint crucifixion? The question is, why would he do this? Why would he apply the Cubist technique to the subject of crucifixion? Now, when Picasso was making his crucifixion, he was influenced by surrealism. And in his crucifixion, he was trying to conflate the themes of suffering and death and agony on the one hand, and the themes of pagan rituals on the other hand. This conflation of human suffering and pagan religiosity would be one of the features of modern crucifixion. So in this crucifixion, Picasso is interested in basically human violence, human drive toward death. And again, that would be very characteristic of 20th century crucifixions that would focus more not on the value of salvation and resurrection, but rather than death and dissipation. So here is the basic connection. Cubism and this idea of death and dissipation, and Christ's death and Christ's sufferings. Now, generally speaking, Picasso in his paintings wants to come to the depth of things. So hence his conceptual view of the world, rather than the visual view of the world. So when Picasso unmasks the world, unmasks the materiality of the world, he comes to the skeleton of things. And in those skeleton of things, he sees the chained spirits of nature, the pagan gods. So here is the connection to the crucifixion. And another interesting thing is that crucifixion predates Picasso's Guernica, and Guernica was the premonition of the Spanish Civil War. So there is a connection here as well. Picasso senses something in the air. He senses something horrible and devastating. And first he paints crucifixion and then Guernica. So an interesting feature is that Christ is in white and everything else is in color. Here is another Cubist painting of crucifixion, very different, by Renato Guttuso. arguably the greatest Italian artist of the 20th century, fellow cubist, very dear friend of Picasso, also the member of the Communist Party of Italy. But there are differences between Guttuso and Picasso. First of all, Guttuso was a social artist. He always was saying that his art has some social purpose, unlike Picasso, who always was trying to distance himself from social ideologies. Second, in his painting style, Guttuso uses the so-called international cubism, which means that his paintings are three-dimensional, not flat, and he kind of dissects his objects against the background of the three-dimensional world. This crucifixion is about the rise of fascism, Nazism, and communism, and the Europe that stands at the break of the Second World War. So you see that Jesus is crucified between the two thieves, and one of the thieves is red, which may be suggestive of communism, and the second one may be suggesting of Nazism. The controversial thing here is that Mary Magdalene is naked, and Vatican was offended by that, and the painting was very controversial. Actually, let me tell you, the painting was excluded from official exhibitions in Italy up until 1972. And just one more about Cubism. Actually, it's Cubo-futurism. Jacques Villon, who was the brother of Marcel Duchamp, 20th century art icon, also an artist. And he uses cubist and futurist techniques. This is a lithograph, Crucifixion. Now, futurism was another 20th century movement that was very close to Cubism in terms of its style. The style is pretty much the same, but the intention is different. Cubism was static, and its intention was to dissect the object. Futurism was dynamic, and its intention was to synthesize the beauty of the world. And the main purpose of futurism was to transmit the power of time in painting. So to kind of show, express the motion, the movement. So that's why futurist paintings, although using the same cubist techniques, are much more dynamic and colorful and vibrant. So hence this crucifixion, which is done in a cubist technique, but again, it's colorful, vibrant, and the colors suggest resurrection rather than the crucifixion. The dissection of the object suggests the crucifixion, but the colors and the overall dynamism suggests resurrection. Now, moving on to surrealism. Surrealism was the main art movement in the 20th century between the wars, between the First and the Second World War. And surrealism, as you may know, was invented by André Breton, who was inspired by Sigmund Freud. The main purpose of surrealism was to express the power of human subconscious. And the way to do it, they thought, would be to bypass reason, to bypass morality, to bypass any aesthetic consideration. So as such, surrealism seems like a very irrationalist movement, which it was. And therefore, it was not close to religion. Surrealists were communists. André Breton was communist. He published his first surrealist manifesto in his own surrealist magazine, but later he joined this magazine with the communist newspaper in France. So they flirted with communism. In the end, they found out that communism is not for them. But they flirted with it for a while. They also flirted with Eastern religions, with religions like Buddhism, with New Age movement, with different kind of alternative spiritualities. So there was some religious or kind of spiritualist flavor in surrealism. But surrealism overall did not produce a lot of crucifixions. I will show you just a couple of examples. The first one comes from Salvador Dali, who, of course, is considered to be the surrealist par excellence, but who painted his crucifixions when he was not already a member of the movement. In the second part of his life, he moved back to religion of his youth, to Catholicism, and he has done a series of religious paintings, crucifixions just one of the examples. Salvador Dali was not a surrealist in the way Breton was. André Breton preached that when creating art, human mind should be passive, so that we encounter our subconscious and we kind of relate it to the art. And Salvador Dali, from the beginning of his career, insisted that our mind is active and we create ourselves the world in which we live. Hence, he called his style a paranoid critical activity. And later in his life, he rediscovered science. He was fascinated by nuclear physics. And he thought that when humans penetrate the depth of this world, they would find something that is spiritual and religious. So this is his idea behind his crucifixions. If Picasso, when he unmasks the world, what he finds is chaos. When Salvador Dali unmasks the materiality of the world, he finds some subatomic particles which he thought were angels. And Jesus is that ultimate reality that holds the whole world together. So that is Dali's crucifixion. And these are just two examples. This is the first one, and this is the second one. The second one probably being even more famous. Corpus Hypercubus. And the second surrealist examples comes from Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall was not a surrealist painter, formally speaking. He was not a member of the group. But Breton, when he reviewed his paintings, thought of him as one of their own. Chagall's style is influenced by primitivism, by cubism, by surrealism, and the overall dreamlike atmosphere of his paintings made Breton suggest that Chagall is one of their own. Although Chagall himself told one of his interviewers that he always slept well without Freud. So formally, he was not a surrealist. Now, what's interesting in Chagall's crucifixion is that this is the first painting made by a Jew of Christ. Chagall was a Jew, a Hasidic Jew. He grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family. He had problems with becoming a painter, actually, because it is forbidden in ultra-Orthodox environment to be engaged in those kind of activities. But in most of his paintings, for one church there will be one synagogue, and for some Christians there will be some Jews. So he portrays basically Jesus as the Jew par excellence. So that's why we see Jesus as a Jew here, with those typical Jewish elements on the cross, and here we see the Jews who are trying to save themselves from pogroms, who are being persecuted, who are, emigrate to other countries, etc. All those horrors of the Jews in the 20th century are focused in the figure of Jesus. So that is an interesting perspective. Now, moving on to abstract expressionism. Where are we? Okay. So, moving on to abstract expressionism, Barnett Newman. Let me see. Abstraction was probably one of the most significant innovations in 20th century painting, because it broke not only with 500 years of tradition of representation, like Cubism did, but for the first time in Western art, it created a completely non-representational art. Abstraction came in two waves. The first wave, represented by Kandinsky, and others before and after the First World War, and the second wave here in the United States after the Second World War. So I will be giving examples from the second wave, abstract expressionism, which is different from the first wave because it also incorporates some influences from surrealism. Abstract expressionism basically is a combination of abstraction and surrealism. But unlike classical surrealism, abstract expressionists were more interested in Carl Gustav Jung rather than Sigmund Freud. And Carl Gustav Jung, who was a disciple of Freud and a collaborator, co-founder of psychoanalysis, had a very different idea about human subconscious. According to Jung, human subconscious is collective. We share a certain level of subconscious mind, and in this unconscious or subconscious level of our human mind, the so-called archetypes are stored, the basic ideas which find their way, which are manifested in art. And that's how Jung explained the similarity in art in different times and cultures and civilizations, etc. So abstract expressionists, when they create their abstract compositions, they are trying to express not only, well, not so much individual subconscious with sexual urges and violence, but rather this collective level of subconscious which is more mythological and more peaceful. Because the main idea of Jung was that in order to not to have problems with mental health, using the way psychologists talk now, if you do not want to have problems with mental health, you should find a healthy balance between what's inside you and what's outside you. So by producing art, an artist is trying to find this balance. So abstract expressionism is about the mythological dimension of things, and in this case, of crucifixion. So this particular example is more abstract than expressionist. The next one is more expressionist than abstract. And we move here to Europe. Francis Bacon is an English painter whose works represent a European version of post-war abstract expressionism. Again, more expressionist than abstract. I would personally say that Bacon is, in a way, a disciple of Picasso. He develops the themes of Picasso, but he applies those themes to post-war Europe and to the situation in post-war Europe, and he applies it to his own style of abstract expressionism. But like in Picasso's Crucifixion, Bacon's crucifixions are not about Christ, are not about resurrection. They are about suffering, death, inhumanity, and basically they evoke the images of slaughterhouses. So in Bacon's crucifixions, we see the inevitability of death, the inhumanity of man, and those figures, those horrifying, I would say, figures, are not divine. They are half human, half animal. Again, I see the traces of Picasso here, from Picasso to Bacon, likewise from Kafka to Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, if you make some parallels between painting and literature. And if you make another parallel with music, let's say from Stravinsky, who is a modern composer, but still has some kind of flavor of classical music, to Schoenberg, to complete deconstruction in music, to music as silence, and things like that. But not all abstract expressionists are producing paintings of that kind. So here is a pretty typical classical crucifixion by Graham Sutherland, another English painter. and this is his famous Crucifixion, which is done in the same style, but classical, religious, and not controversial. Just one more. Look at this. Antonio Saura. This is a Spanish, quite famous Spanish artist of the second half of the 20th century. He is a surrealist and abstract expressionist, so this is one of his crucifixions. And in this crucifixion, the image of Christ is completely dissolved into something that is chaotic. Saura, like Picasso, like so many of 20th century artists, is interested in suffering and violence, in that aspect of crucifixion, and addresses this in his paintings. Now, the last 20th century art movement that I would like to talk about is postmodernism. So what is postmodernism? As the word suggests, it's something that comes after modernism. But what is modernism? Modernism is an ideology that is based on science and human rationality. So postmodernism seems to be a continuation of that. However, postmodernists, in my view, are not different from modernists. They just continue the ideology of modernism by extending it to other extremes. So here is the thing. In modernism, people still have some kind of absolute, and this absolute is science. Science is considered to be something that should not be questioned, that should have authority over all people, if it is real science, of course. So modernity and modernism question religion as something that cannot be verified objectively, but still retain science as an objective authority. Postmodernists go even further and deconstruct science as one of the absolutes. So the main idea of postmodernism is the deconstruction of all absolutes, including religion, science, and anything else. In the language of postmodernism, this is called delegitimation of knowledge, and they describe those various ways of dealing with reality as different language games. So science is one language game, religion is another language game, magic is another language game, etc. But the main point of postmodernism is that all those language games are equal, and therefore no language game should be given preference. So hence religion comes back, but not as the religion, but as one of the language games, and so are others. So the two main features of postmodern art are the coming back of figuration, because abstraction is just one of the artistic language games, and figuration may come back. And the second feature of postmodern art is the so-called minority art, because minorities are usually oppressed by the majority who pretend that their absolute, their narrative is dominant and therefore should be respected by everybody. But according to postmodernism, every narrative has its own legitimation or legitimacy. So therefore, postmodern artists focus in their art on something that was oppressed, repressed, forgotten, hence the minority art. So here are some examples of crucifixion in postmodern art. Now this is a rare example of a crucifixion in pop art. Pop art can be seen as the revival of figuration and therefore the beginning of postmodernism. But pop art is so different from the theme of crucifixion, because pop art was about the glorification of popular culture, commercialism, video, advertisement, etc. Pop art has an ironic qualities and take-it-easy attitude, so not compatible with crucifixion. So you won't find many crucifixions in pop art. This is just one of them. And still, here, it has an ironic quality. It's kind of a parody on the depiction of crucifixion in Western culture. Now, as for the minority art, we can find a lot of crucifixions here. So this is just one of the examples by an American painter, William Johnson. This is an example of an African-American crucifixion, Afro-American crucifixion. Johnson was trying to conflate primitivism with postmodernism, with postmodern art. For him, primitivism or Africanness means purity and depth. So he portrays his Jesus as a black person, symbolic of, Jesus being closer to the roots of spirituality. For Johnson, primitivism and spirituality is pretty much the same. So here is one example, and another example of the same kind. Black Messiah in those postmodern paintings during the social unrest in America in the 60s would be replaced by Brother Jesus, Jesus who is seen as the friend of all the oppressed people. And here just another example of that kind of attitude. Francis Sousa, an Indian painter, who paints Jesus as an African or tribal mask. And finally, a contemporary American artist, probably the most popular, commercially speaking, artist in the United States, Julian Schnabel, a postmodern artist, and this is an example of a feminist crucifixion in which Jesus is depicted as a woman. Another way of creating a minority act. So Jesus is conflated with all people who are oppressed, basically. So let me conclude my brief presentation with this crucifixion by an Australian painter, Arthur Boyd. It's called Crucifixion and Rose, and I think it's very important in terms of my thesis. Here Jesus is portrayed against the background of an Australian landscape. And the rose is of most importance in this painting. The rose may symbolize various things: purity, celestial qualities, but in this particular painting, virginity. But in this particular painting, rose is a symbol of the English culture, or more generally, the culture of the Enlightenment, or modernity. There is a tension between modernity and traditional cultures. And what Boyd is trying to say with this painting is that this rose does not take roots, it floats. But when the rose takes roots, it destroys. So there is this unending tension between the rationalist and secular ideology of modernity and traditional cultures that are based on religion. And I think this is the key to understanding the transformation which the crucifixion underwent in the 20th century. 20th century crucifixions, or modern crucifixions, usually depict this tension between modernity and traditional cultures. They depict the modern attitude toward culture. That's why they usually center on suffering and death rather than resurrection and ascension. So in this crucifixion, we are facing the question of the tension between modernity and tradition, and this is the main, I think, the main content of 20th century crucifixions. Just one more. You see these hands? And remember Grunewald? So the common denominator of all the 20th century crucifixions is this transformation of crucifixion from a purely religious event with dogmatic and theological implications to a basic cultural archetype of righteous suffering. And as such, the crucifixion serves various purposes for various painters. It can be a traditional religious purpose, or it can be a social message, or it can be an existential message, etc., etc., etc. As such, it becomes a perfect vehicle to express the existential and social realities of the 20th century history. So that's how Christ was crucified again and again on the canvases of those painters, who have brought a new dimension and modern perspective to the death of the Savior that took place 2,000 years ago in the dark corner of the Roman Empire. Thank you.